Okay, thank you very much. I've just been informed that this is being recorded, which is fine by me. So let us get right in. There's a fair amount to go through, so I hope I will manage, even though some things will then become a little bit brief, but hopefully there'll be time for some questions or some follow-up asynchronously or email or whatever afterwards. So I'm going to be going through this notion of what I've called here radical multimodality, and we'll see in what sense it's radical as we start. And I'm also going to be making connections with disciplinary boundaries and empirical research. So, setting the scene, I'm going to be more or less assuming that we know what multimodality is, given the setting for this talk, but still there's going to be some refreshers of what, why now, and how, and particularly the why and the how will be getting hit upon. And to start off, and what in, I think, this kind of communicative situation that we see here in the picture is one which, of course, we're all completely used to nowadays. We see here a few people sitting around a dinner table after dinner, and how are they interacting? They're interacting in traditional, well-tried and tested ways in which they actually talk and sometimes even look at each other. But you'll see also scattered around there are a range of devices, and how they're interacting with the devices is also varied. They may be using their own device, they might be sharing a device with fingers and all sorts of things. So this is a very common situation. It's also inherently multimodal, but pushing that further, it's multimodal in several interesting ways, which I think need to have more emphasis focused on them. This is one of the starting points, but there are a few boundaries there that respect traditional discipline boundaries. If we look at this and say, now I'm going to study what's happening, then no discipline is going to be able to come up with all the answers there. There's no digital, non-digital divide, since some of the devices are digital, but they get poked at with fingers. Many disciplines have important things to say about aspects of what's going on, but no one of them, including, I will suggest, multimodality, as it is often traditionally, I'll say traditionally, even though tradition is only 20, 30, 40 years, how that is traditionally been conceived. None of those is sufficient. One of the reasons it's not sufficient is if we expand the focus somewhat, then I would consider all of the things which you see on this page as targets of multimodality, since they use different ways, different forms of expression. And we can expand that. Let's throw in a cathedral. Maybe we want to be looking at some of the architectural properties there. We could throw in infographics of various kinds. We could throw in here this image stolen from Bielefeld, where there's a mixed virtual and real environment. We could also consider things which move and make noise. So there's a lot of variation there. Now, all of these I would consider to be part of what multimodality needs to be focusing at. So multimodality, in my view, is essentially the study of how effective communication can work with any possible form of expression and combination of form of expression. So that naturally goes across all media. So we have here quite a range of things to be looking at. So the task of multimodality, the challenge, is how to analyze these complex signifying practices, which are now very typical, taken for granted in contemporary society, and how can we do this systematically, providing methods to make sense of these things. We also want to then address issues of scale. Many of the individual artifacts or performances which we saw on the previous slides, they're addressed in small-scale studies, qualitative studies. Somebody might be writing a paper on a couple of them, but I think one of the important challenges now for multimodality across the board is to be going beyond that, going towards real scale. So moving beyond the case study there, moving across qualitative and quantitative, going across humanities and scientific descriptions, because many different areas have interest here, spanning description, prediction, experiment, reception studies, and design and use as well. So how the notions of design become increasingly relevant here. So taking that all together, then we ask, or where I'd like to ask next is, how would disciplines help us in this? And what I'm going to draw attention to is the following development. I can go back in. Multimodality is considered transdisciplinary, whatever that might mean. Multimodality is a transdisciplinary approach to meaning making. And there are a whole bunch of references and people who have said that. But if we consider what that means, then we get into certain difficulties. Here's a comment about semiotics traditionally from Theo van Leuven, where he says, one of the key characteristics of semiotics is its multimodality. However, semiotics has then developed monomodal specializations. So we see here a recreation of traditional disciplines within semiotics, even though semiotics should be something which is inherently multimodal. So going to disciplines, what do we observe? If we look at a whole range of disciplines, and I have, and work happily with many of the people in those disciplines, then what we see over the years, and the exact time scale varies for discipline, is that there is a progressive gradual extension over the past 20, 30, 40 years from a core area, I'll say here a core mode of the discipline considers its own, into multimodal areas. So the discipline has a kind of multimodal halo. And it doesn't really make much difference which discipline you go to. As long as it's about communication, then they've gone through this kind of process. We could go through subfields. We go through 3 or 4 different subfields of linguistics, and each of them, independently of the others, has moved into something which is more multimodal. We could go into film studies. Film studies moves towards music. We have something like argumentation theory, which has had an on and off relationship with multimodality for ages. So many, many disciplines are doing this. So we have this situation where we have discipline, another discipline, another discipline, and they're all growing these multimodal halos around them. Now it's interesting when they start to overlap, because then interesting things can happen. That's where you might have transdisciplinary research, because you have shared phenomena, or interdisciplinary research, or you might just have plain competition, where they say, like, get off, those are my phenomena, go away. So I have all those ranges of interactions there. What we've observed looking at this development is that many of these halos have something in common. They raise similar kind of issues. So instead of having this expansion out from particular disciplines, we've considered what it would mean to throw away the discipline part and look at this multimodal aspect in its own right. And so focus instead on the phenomenon of multimodality. So there we want to look at how different disciplines would make use of multimodal concepts, but looking at multimodality as an area of investigation in its own right. To do that, then we need certain foundations. And we need to ask, to get started, are there questions and results that range across different disciplinary concerns? If the concerns were only within particular disciplines, then there would be no reason to have this separate view of multimodality. So are there general questions, general methodologies, which could then apply more broadly? Now, of course, I've set that up. I'm going to consider the answer to this as a very clear yes. There are questions and results that reoccur independently of discipline. And those are going to be, what is a semiotic mode? How can you find them and what should they do? What is the relationship between semiotic modes and materiality? What is the relationship between semiotic modes and media? And answers to these questions, they all have significant implications for methodology. So you can find versions of these questions being asked in most of the disciplines that have extended their original remits to look at things a little bit more multimodally, but we're going to put these center stage and say, okay, what are these particular issues here? Now, for today, or this evening, I'm going to be focusing on these main basic constructs: semiotic mode, materiality, media, and methodology. I won't be doing that equally. I will be trying to look at some of the consequences and the strategies there and outlook which follow from this orientation. To get there, I will begin primarily with semiotic mode and its relationship with materiality. I will then very briefly jump over medium, and then I hope quickly to then get to the methodology and the methodological consequences and implications after that. So that's where we will start. So a basic question of defining modes. One hears sometimes of semiotic modes. When one says multimodal, then there's something after the multi, and this is then the modality. So what is that? What is multi in multimodality? The view which we've been developing moves away from the sensory channel notion of mode. So this is one which is quite common and also useful, particularly in psychology, where one looks at sensory modes. So I'm moving away from that and looking at semiotic modes as essentially semiotic constructs. So semiotic modes are ways of shaping materials for communicative purposes. And this includes communicating with yourself, externalizing information in any way. So this is then starting modes. To get some context to that, I start here from a quote which I think is very useful from Günter Kress and Theo van Leeuwen from the early 2000s, where they're noting in their work towards multimodality and semiotic modes, they're observing here a specific color has first of all of itself a potential for meaning as a signifier due to and in its materiality and interaction with the physiology of bodies. So this goes towards the perception side. But second, it also has meaning potential because of its cultural history. Now, these two aspects I take as to be inalienable parts or components of a definition of semiotic mode, which is powerful enough to do the work that we're going to want it to do later. So constructing multimodality from scratch, this is the foundation. A semiotic mode can come into being whenever there is some material substrate that is sufficiently controllable, shapeable, manipulable as to admit of purposeful articulations. And when you have such a thing, and that can be anything, material can be absolutely anything, then there's a possibility that through use and habit and convention, a semiotic mode can be constructed. So I'm going to do this graphically. We have material, and the material can exhibit regularities. It can be shaped in various ways. We can then start organizing our description of these regularities, and we can be traditional linguists and talk about paradigmatic and syntagmatic organization, where we have alternations and structures, and this is then our starting point for talking about semiotic modes. And Günter Kress has this nice notion of material socially shaped to get us started. Now, a few very, very quick points going through this before we take the next critical step. Multiple semiotic modes. Material substrates are typically dense. They offer rich potential for carrying simultaneous patterning. That means you can bend and manipulate materials in many ways at the same time, independently of each other. So you may have multiple semiotic modes developing on the basis of single substrates. Languages is a good example of this. So if we take the language system and assume for the moment that it uses the sound stream, then there's also other things happening at the same time which are using the sound stream, like intonation or emotion or other indicators. So semiotic mode here, we may have several of them on the same material. So language is clearly a composite mode because it's evolved as a combination of distinct modal contributions. But there are also a whole range of visual spatial semiotic modes as well. And these are not traditionally distinguished sufficiently as yet. In fact, we don't even know in many cases what they are. So is film a semiotic mode? Comics, IKEA instructions, semiotic mode, infographics. Now, all of these, we consider these questions to be empirical issues. So if we find evidence for semiotic modes which meet the definitional criteria, then we would call that a semiotic mode, but an empirical question. This is an example of how quickly one gets into multimodality here, this straightforward page we would characterize as being made up of a whole range of different semiotic modes, ranging from photographs, geopolitical maps, the organization of the layout of the material. All of these are semiotic modes with their own ways of shaping the material which is available to them. And although I won't go into it here, this has consequences for issues of literacy, particularly multi-literacies. Each of these semiotic modes, because it has its own conventions and history of development, then they need to be considered with respect to what one needs to know in order to be able to use them effectively. So that's literacy. So, excuse me. There are various potential carriers of semiotic modes of quite distinct kinds. The only constraint is that they're perceptible. So one might have various kinds of spatiality, regions which are either disjoint or touching or overlapping, or various gestalt properties, phenomena, which all can be used for shaping material for the purpose of allowing semiotic modes to grow. So basic properties and tenets here: any given materiality can support an arbitrary number of semiotic modes simultaneously. And semiotic modes can cross-cut sensory channels. I emphasize that because that can often be forgotten, but it's an essential part of the model here. We're not talking about sensory channels separately. So to decompose any object or performance for analysis, it's always necessary to consider which semiotic modes are active. That is, without deciding on a set of semiotic modes to apply, we have no basis for deciding what material distinctions are relevant. So there may be a whole bunch of things happening, but unless we have assigned them or attributed them some semiotic significance by virtue of anchoring them into a semiotic mode, we're not going to know which of those distinctions are relevant for some kind of study and which are just varying for some other reason. Now, the next and final step for defining a semiotic mode, as we haven't got there quite yet, is that all semiotic modes, if they're worth calling semiotic modes, grow themselves what I would call a discourse semantics. And the discourse semantics depends on the use made of the mode and the affordances of its material substrate. And if you find different semantics at work, then that's a good empirical indication that, yes, you have got different semiotic modes. So moving on then from what I would metaphorically call grammar, which is more like the organizational forms, or the organization placed on forms, to get to interpretation, then we require discourse. So we have this additional layer or stratum of discourse semantics. So discourse semantics is what makes all the forms interpretable in context. So that's an essential component. We got good models of how that works in language, and this then generalizes that across all semiotic modes. So this is all fairly abstract, so let's make it very specific. If we look at this and we say, well, what's going on here? Then visually we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 shapes, which we can segment via Gestalt principles. But if we ask, well, what are they doing? Then there are different discourse relations which could apply. We could have this and this and this and this and this, which means we got 5 of these things all next to each other for some reason. Alternatively, we could have a discourse relation of and then. Now, as we know, and this is from a textbook, school textbook, and as we know, everybody from about 6 years of age onwards will probably think more of this interpretation. But very crucially here, that is a discourse hypothesis. It is not given by the visual materials. What we have is the discourse semantics saying that there are possible relationships which here hold, and we look for the relationship which makes the most sense. And this is then how discourse semantics is aiding interpretation. So we have hypotheses about what we are seeing, and we have cues about what we are seeing or not seeing, and these interact with each other So in order to know what to see, we need to decide what we're seeing. And that's a semiotic decision. So decision is in quotes there because this is normally happening without us being aware of it. So semiotically, I would say that it's a necessary decision behind the scenes, and we are making hypotheses about which semiotic modes apply to interpret whatever it is that we are trying to engage with. A few points, just to mention these on the way as well. Discourse is seen as dynamic, so it uses notions of dynamic semantics. It's an abductive semantics, following Peirce, and that means that you are always making hypotheses. And if we look at why that's a good idea, if we have some phrase, well, I've read circular table, we can look at this syntactically, either as being a constituency structure, but we can also look at this as a dependency structure where we have a unfolding dynamic organization. And this dynamic semantics view comes from Nick Asher and Alex Laskaridis in the particular form that we use it here, developed further by my colleagues there. Now, why is this a nice idea? And because it doesn't depend upon any syntax, it doesn't depend upon structure in a grammatical syntactic sense. So I can say large, red, circular, and well, these then are put together in precisely the same way. This is the German version of the Rittersport advertisement. I think the English ones don't work quite so well, but that's why I take the German one here, where you see these three properties being put out, and they're put together discoursally. They're not put together in terms of syntax. This also relates to things like early child language with Scotland from ages ago. This was also a sequence of utterances which were put together discursively rather than using a syntax. This is good news for multimodality as we look at coverbal gesture, because one can start replacing ways or forms of expression. So if I have this large red circular table, I could, instead of circular, then do some motion with my hands. Like it's a circular, circle, circular, circular. I could also say that something is large by moving my hands, like saying the fish that got away was so large. So in general, although there are interesting constraints, for example, Ellen Flicker has gone into in great detail, dynamic discourse is far less sensitive to where the information is coming from. So if we have examples like gesture or images or written language or closeness or movement, discourse in its way of building meaning dynamically doesn't really mind where the information comes from. So this means that we have a mechanism for combining semiotic modes. We have the discourse semantics, and the different modes correspond to multiple discourses. And the discourse semantics is what provides the glue to multiply very different materialities together. So sometimes one has the metaphor of multiplying meanings. If you have two very different materialities, like a color and a loud noise, then it's very unclear what it means to multiply those together. So if we go via the discourse semantics, then we have something which we can actually get our hands on formally. And to do this, we often then also apply notions of blends. And blends here are seen as discoursally active and materially anchored. So if I put this out a little bit more graphically, diagrammatically, if we have image, then we have some form commitments of the image, which will lead us to a discourse semantic interpretation, which is an abductive hypothesis about the interpretation. Can do exactly the same with text, using some well-known methods. And then we have a notion of blending the discourse semantic structures together. The blending there is used in a formal sense to say that we need to have similar structures which are identified by the discourse semantics. And as always with the abductive interpretation, we're looking here for the story that best makes sense of the information that we have. And these will typically go and look at context. Now this draws on a range of sources, as many of you will have guessed. For example, as I've mentioned, the dynamic discourse approach comes from Asher and Laskaridis, also some old work from Jerry Hobbs. The notion of blending discourse semantic structures formally is taken from Joseph Gauguin, and of course going back into the entire cognitive linguistic tradition on blends. And doing all this in the multimodal context is what I have been focusing on together with my colleague Janina Wildfeuer for quite a while. So this is then treating discourse semantics as a mediator. Now, it's very important not to overcommit to these earlier levels here. And the reason for that is that it can seriously mess analyses up, and it can also make things more difficult than they need to be. So as back to this as an example, if I already interpret this as visually indicating that there's a temporal sequence, I've overcommitted. If I interpret this as being visually saying that there are just 5 things in a row and there is no temporal development, then I've also overcommitted. So what's important is to separate out what the form commits to and what the individual semiotic modes make available as potential discourse interpretations. And that's particularly the case if we put back the text, which the original actually uses. Here we have then the discourse semantics of the text, which can come in as well, and so help refine when we come to the overall most coherent description. Then we're very quickly forced to take a temporal view. So semiotic mode, I've taken this as a core meaning generating engine. So the semiotic mode is what makes the entire thing go. But one needs more. Semiotic modes do not exist in a vacuum. And so we need to address what else do we need. And then for the consequences and methodological considerations, what methods can we use for uncovering them? So semiotic modes, very important, but we need some more. First thing we need, and this is where I'm going to jump over very quickly, because there's a lot to say here, but I'm not going to say it, is the notion of medium. So any of you who have worked on the somewhat contorted area of defining medium, be that in any particular domain or philosophically or whatever, it's quite a complicated area, but I'm going to simplify it and relate it to semiotic modes as follows. Here we have this diagrammatic version of a semiotic mode again, and there are lots of them. And the medium is quite simply a collection of semiotic modes. It's a collection which is historically conditioned. So we have a conventionalized, socio-historically developed ensemble of, or set of habits for putting semiotic modes together. Semiotic mode is the way of making meanings, and the medium is the site for mobilizing semiotic modes. Now that's all I'm going to say about medium, because all I'm going to use medium for later is for making the methodology clear. So the consequences here we've got a considerable amount of theoretical background and constructs. So I apologize for running over those theoretical constructs very, very quickly. But one needs them to take the next step, where one asks the question, what good does that do us? What do we do with all of this stuff? Apart from, I would claim, adding some conceptual clarity. So now, for the rest of the talk, I'm going to go into the consequences, and particularly the consequences for analytic method. So if we go to our situation again, and this now can stand in as for any situation, imagine we're trying to do some serious, slightly larger scale analysis of this. How do we turn the massive information that we may have into some data rather than just being a collection of stuff? How do we make use of this for analysis? Now, I'm going to suggest that we stick to fairly well-tried and tested methods that we know from linguistics. And I'm not taking linguistics as a general model for how semiotic modes work, but I am taking linguistics as a set of methodologies for engaging with semiotically complex materials. So this methodology, I think, is something which we do need to and can apply with considerable promise of success. So standard empirical method: collect data, develop some classification schemes, annotate the data, look for patterns, maybe make some predictions, maybe do some experiments on behavioral differences. And these should, of course, feed back to the idea of refining your classification schemes and improving your theory. So I'm going to start with these top ones, which are evidently to do with corpora. So I'm looking at corpora, and I'm going to be then pushing this in the multimodal direction, making use of all of the constructs which I've introduced so far. Did I just lose the screen? Or do you see the screen, or did I just lose the screen?
We see your slides at the moment. Now we see the presenter view.
Oh, don't excuse me. Do you hear lots of music?
A little bit. I think it's just through your mic. We don't actually hear the music direct.
Okay, I have to get through some different screens here.
No worries.
You might need to restart the share.
Okay.
When you start the share, there's 2 buttons to click down at the bottom. One is optimize for video, and the other is include like computer audio or something like that.
But how are you now? Can you see the screen now?
We see the screen. We see the presenter view at the moment.
You see the presenter now. Okay, that's easy to fix. How's that?
Perfect.
Okay. That was a little interlude, because we were going over anyway, so I hope you enjoyed the interlude for refocusing. It confirms what I said before about my not having the presenter and the other mode under control at all. It seems to do it randomly for me, but never mind. I'm going to be looking now at the consequences for empirical methods, and particularly looking at corpora, as I said, and making the extension away from standard linguistic views of corpora to what are we going to see as multimodal corpora. So what are corpora anyway? Well, many linguists will say, well, they're collections of authentic texts. That's why they're great, because they're authentic. There's one thing there which we want to focus on, and that's the notion of texts. So is that sufficient? Can that stand? We also have a division between, say, archives, where you actually collect the objects that you're going to be looking at, and corpora in the linguistic sense, which via Saussure and Helmsleb and a few others can actually be seen as collections of abstract representations of texts or performances. They're not the things themselves, they are abstract representations of those. Now, this abstraction is necessary, but we need to be increasingly careful, don't lose essential information when we start moving beyond what we're familiar with from language. If we do, or if we're not sufficiently careful, then the entire notion of authenticity will come there under quite a lot of strain. So I will make that point by this rather exaggerated consideration of, this is probably, I would claim, often the linguistic theory view of text. And that is, you try and ignore materiality, and you just have a sequence of things. And many of the theoretical models are based upon sequence. They're based upon linearity, and structures then are built on top of this linearity. Now, if we move away from what you can see on the screen here to something more like this, then issues arise. What goes missing when we change levels of abstraction? The general answer to that is that we don't yet know, because we haven't done the empirical work. Nobody has done the empirical work. We've begun to see what can go missing, or see what can go missing. For example, if I threw away all the information here apart from the language, then we would have a very clear sense that a huge amount has gone missing. There wouldn't really be much left. So we've obviously lost something important. We wouldn't then be dealing with authentic data either, since those textual bits don't exist anywhere by themselves. They only exist in this context. So how do we start getting hold of this kind of complexity, regardless of what that complexity is? So being very careful that we don't miss this. So the challenge then of multimodal corpora is how to get the necessary information into corpora. Well, what is then the necessary information that we're going to be wanting to get in? So going back to this, corpora, we'll be asking, well, what is the primary data that we'll be putting in? If we take a book or a conversation, and there's a whole range of different data which we could take, transcribing the text, measuring skin resistance, how are we going to decide what is necessary information to put into the corpora? And the challenge there is that the more we move to the visual side, the weaker standard models of text become. And this applies to theory and to descriptive practice. So we've got good theories for the language part, for the visual side, very much weaker. So to take the next step, I'm going to take semiotic modes and actually put them to some use. We do something with it because we want some return on our investment of working out what these things are. And we use these in the following way. Semiotic modes are what determine precisely which contrasts of material distinctions are relevant for production interpretation. That's what they're for. They are there to define which contrasts are relevant for meaning making within the semiotic mode. So this means that we can use this notion for building multimodal corpora. If we go to corpora and we look at how they're done in linguistics, then we have very good treatments or ideas, formalizations of how to do multi-layer descriptions of complex linguistic phenomena. So now we can take the next step and building upon that kind of technology, do this with semiotic modes. So now if we have corpora including artifacts and performances, we can put in the semiotic mode and we can use the description or the framework that the semiotic mode offers for organizing multi-layered descriptions. The
You probably can't hear me, so I'm just interrupting and saying roughly 5 more minutes.
Sure, good, okay. So we can then use the semiotic mode here in the framework for different layers in the annotation frameworks. So we have recognition criteria, we have form-related transcription schemes, and we have discourse-related transcription schemes. And these then provide a framework for doing the organization. Now I'm going to, given the short time, I'm going to jump more or less to the examples of using this. I'm just going to leave out a couple of slides here. So if we go on further, let's go to this one. So just two examples to move us on. Now, there's been a very uneven development in tools for analysis. So we have pretty good tools for time-based data, but very few tools for spatially organized data. Although semiotically, exactly the same principles apply. So if we look at now some examples, just to wrap us up and move us to some more concrete cases. We take the first example. This is going to be a static two-dimensional organization. And it's going to be the research question, how does the medium of graphic novels function visually across time and cultures? This is then what I'm going to be looking at. Now we're going to do this in exactly the general way which has been proposed. We take multi-layer descriptions. We ask what is the relevant information to include. Semiotic modes are going to tell us what the relevant information is. And in particular, the form part of the semiotic mode will then indicate what makes sense for a multi-layer description. Now, comics are quite complicated. They have their own many semiotic modes which are in the medium. And I'm going to focus on page composition as something visual which is not often treated very systematically. In fact, if you look in the literature, particularly the more literary literature, there's often suggestions that this is where things become so subjective that one may not be able to analyze them. Because there's a lot happening. Here's page composition, but they can also look like this. They can also look like this. They can also look like this. They can get fairly complicated. So what we've done is work out a semiotic mode of page composition, so we can use the form distinctions in order to annotate data. So we have this view, a page composition corpus, and we use then the definition of the semiotic mode, which we have worked out to give us coding annotation schemes for a corpus. This is the annotation scheme. I'm not going to go through it, obviously. This is a classification network. Results are published here in visual communication, but this is describing page composition. So what we did then was we analyzed a collection of pages, 1,260 pages, 18 pages a year from those decades, 1940 to 2009, and we annotated them in the way which one would normally annotate any kind of data. Using a corpus tool here, we use the image tool from Michael O'Donnell. That is one of the few which is working for visual annotations. We take the system classification, we take all of the data, and we end up with an annotated corpus. And then we can do the normal kind of thing. That is, we export all of the classifications and do a kind of Doug Biber-like PCA, principal components analysis, as he did for the registerial variation. So we take, in his case, grammatical features. In our case, we take the visual features. And then, of course, we could do this for any classification scheme where we have data and see what comes out. So what came out here, if we then plot the results, we see that this is a plot of the first two principal components, and these points here are the various pages. Now, the principal component analysis did not take the dates into consideration at all. It's only based upon the visual properties, and we find here a clustering for all of the pages from the 1940s. This is the clustering for the 1950s pages. This is the clustering for the 1960s pages, for the 1970s pages, 1980s pages, 1990s pages, 2000s pages. And if we put them all together, then we see that in fact, this apparently free variation of this creative visual style is in fact very systematic. And it's gone through a quite systematic progression. I think this is nice to look at because making a linguistic analogy, it seems very similar to the vowel space. So we have groups and movements among vowels, which is kind of interesting. We also looked at this culturally, cross-culturally, where you see similar kind of things. So the point there is to emphasize that by applying the semiotic modes, we can apply a very familiar, especially if you're a linguist, familiar corpus-based approach to things which have very different properties to the language properties. So this was purely visual organization. Now there's one more example. I don't know if I have time to show you this though. What do you think, Peter?
Yeah, one more should be good.
One more, okay. So I'm now going to be looking, okay, very nice. So this is then looking at the relation between corpora and experiments. Now what do experiments need? Experiments need hypotheses to vary and conditions, or hypotheses to investigate and conditions to vary. So what hypotheses and what conditions? And there again, we use the semiotic modes. But in this case, we use the discourse semantics of the semiotic modes, because these are precisely there in order to generate interpretive hypotheses. And the form then gives us the conditions to vary. So this is where we know where it makes sense to vary some material distinctions, because our semiotic mode suggests
Okay, it looks like we have lost John.
Yep, that's what I'm saying as well.
Okay, we probably need to wait for him to come back. Maybe his computer froze or something like that. Now, let me just write to John.
I think John is back. It's just, I don't think.
John, we lost you. Are you back?
I
yeah.
didn't. Yeah.
There you are.
I didn't get any indication that I wasn't there.
Yeah, yeah. We probably missed a minute or so. Sorry. You could what you said last. That would be. Really
Yeah. Please share your screen again, and then we can you can continue and finish that.
Okay. Let me just wrap up, maybe.
Okay, if you go back one slide, because this one we haven't seen yet.
Okay, do you see the presenter or the real slide?
The real slides.
Okay, great. So we did the experiments, right?
Yeah, you started here, exactly. So we didn't see like the last line put in there, I think, or the second two lines.
Okay, so now I'm just going to give the example of doing this, connecting experiments with the semiotic modes and using the discourse semantics as a way of guiding experiments. So this is going to be done with a piece of film. I'm not going to show you the film because there's no time. So in our discourse semantics of the semiotic modes of film, then one of the ones we use quite a lot is cohesion. And this is work from Chao Yi-Seng. And cohesion works essentially by tracking reoccurring visual or sounds or any of the motifs which may occur in film. This is the beginning of The Birds, Hitchcock's The Birds. And if we look here, then there is a particular character which reoccurs across that sequence, and tracking this is then the work which cohesion does. So we have a cohesive chain of this character who we do not yet know is Melanie, but turns out to be Melanie, occurring across these. If you do that analysis, then you have a collection of chains which describe the reoccurring discourse reference in the film. So this is then the discourse description, and then the empirical part, this is an example here, is we mess with that. So here is some exploratory studies, which Chao Yi-Seng is still doing, with Jochen Laubach in Potsdam, where we take some sequences and then we break the cohesive ties, and then we see if it makes any difference. So our hypothesis would be, if the semiotic mode really does use the cohesion as part of its discourse semantics, breaking that should make a difference. If it doesn't make a difference, then we have to change the semiotic mode. So here are the manipulations, cued versions, which are the original, and uncued versions, which are broken. Where we break comes from the discourse semantics. This tells us what it makes sense to break. That's where we predict there'll be a difference. So final, if we go to this shot from the beginning, we have here Melanie, if you know the film, going into what's clearly indicated as Davidson's Pet Shop, and we manipulate the film so that you can't read Davidson's Pet Shop anymore. We can check that people, in fact, respond to this. Here's the eye tracking, where people who, with the pet shop still there, people look at it, they read it, and when it's not there, they don't read it. They don't know they've read it. Often people would not then be aware of any difference. But this shows us that what we generally know, and that is people, it's very difficult to stop people reading text. Now, if we look at then the consequences of that, we can do a questionnaire. We did a little trial with very few people to see if it made a difference. And although there aren't enough here to have real strong, significant results, there is a difference here. And we also see a difference in the eye tracking results. So this is the one which, the original, the top one is the cued original. And we see that when Melanie is here looking at something, this is exactly what we'd predict from normal film theory. With the messed around version, this didn't happen. And this is showing that this effect on the cohesion had consequences for the behavior, in this case, the eye tracking. And so, to conclude there, we have a way of bringing together the semiotic modes to anchor empirical work into developing theory and description. So the semiotic modes offer a theoretical frame for relating corpus annotation streams, and semiotic modes then also can help bridge between the corpus studies and the experimentation. But the semiotic mode gives us a way of organizing our corpus work. And there are more slides, but I think I better stop there just to give any quick chance there to go on. Yeah, so thanks. Sorry for the break in the middle.